citizens. I have now arrived at a point where I must enter upon the real development of the question. I cannot promise to do this in a very satisfactory way, because to do so I should be obliged to go over the whole field of political economy. I can, as the French would say, but effleure la question, touch upon the main points. The first question we have to put is, what is the value of a commodity? How is it determined? At first sight, it would seem that the value of a commodity is a quite relative and not to be settled without considering one commodity and its relations to all other commodities. In fact, in speaking of the value in exchange of a commodity, we mean the proportional quantities in which it exchanges with all other commodities. But then arises the question, how are the proportions in which commodities exchange with each other regulated? We know from experience that these proportions vary infinitely. Taking one single commodity, wheat for instance, we shall find that a quarter of wheat exchanges in almost countless variations of proportion with other commodities. Yet its value remaining always the same, whether expressed in silk, gold, or any other commodity. It must be something distinct from and independent of these different rates of exchange with different articles. It must be possible to express in a very different form these various equations with various commodities. Besides, if I say a quarter of wheat exchanges with iron in a certain proportion, or the value of a quarter of wheat is expressed in a certain amount of iron, I say that the value of wheat and its equivalent in iron are equal to some third thing, which is neither wheat nor iron, because I suppose them to express the same magnitude in two different shapes. Either of them, wheat or the iron, must therefore, independently of the other, be reducible to this third thing, which is their common measure. To elucidate this point, I shall recur to a very simple geometrical illustration. In comparing the areas of triangles of all possible forms and magnitudes, or comparing triangles with rectangles, or any other rectilinear figure, how do we proceed? We reduce the area of any triangle, whatever, to an expression quite different from the visible form. Having found from the nature of the triangle that its area is equal to half its product of its base by its height, we can then compare the different values of all sorts of triangles and of all rectilinear figures, whatever, because all of them may be resolved into a certain number of triangles. The same mode of procedure must obtain with the values of commodities. We must be able to reduce all of them to an expression common to all, and distinguishing them only by the proportions in which they contain that identical measure. As the exchangeable values of commodities are only social functions of those things and have nothing at all to do with the natural qualities, we must first ask, what is the common substance of all commodities? It is labor. To produce a commodity, a certain amount of labor must be bestowed upon it or worked up in it. And I say not only labor, but social labor. A man who produces an article for his own immediate use to consume it himself creates a product, but not a commodity. As a self-sustaining producer, he has nothing to do with society. But to produce a commodity, a man must not only produce an article satisfying some social want, but his labor itself must form part and parcel of the total sum of labor expended by society. It must subordinate to the division of labor within society. It is nothing without the other divisions of labor, and on its part is required to integrate them. If we consider commodities as values, we consider them exclusively under the single aspect of realized, fixed, or if you like, crystallized social labor. In this respect, they can differ only by representing greater or smaller amounts of labor. As, for example, a greater amount of labor may be worked up in a silken handkerchief than a brick. But how does one measure these quantities of labor? By the time the labor lasts. In measuring the labor by the hour, the day, etc. Of course, to apply this measure, all sorts of labor are reduced to average or simple labor as their unit. We arrive, therefore, at this conclusion. A commodity has value because it is a crystallization of social labor. The greatness of its value, or its relative value, depends upon the greater or less amount of that social substance contained in it. That is to say, on the relative mass of labor necessary for its production. The relative values of commodities are, therefore, determined by the respective quantities or amounts of labor worked up, realized, and fixed in them. The correlative quantities of commodities which can be produced in the same time of labor are equal. Or the value of one commodity is to the value of another commodity as the quantity of labor fixed in the one is to the quantity of labor fixed in the other. I suspect that many of you will ask, does then indeed there exist such a vast or any difference whatever between determining the values of commodities by wages and determining them by the relative quantities of labor necessary for their production? You must, however, be aware that the reward for labor, the quantity of labor, are quite disparate things. Suppose, for example, equal quantities of labor to be fixed in 1/4 of wheat and 1 ounce of gold. I resort to the example because it was used by Benjamin Franklin in his first essay published in 1721 and entitled A Modest Inquiry into the Nature and the Necessity of a Paper Currency, where he, one of the first, hit upon the true nature of value. Well, we suppose then that 1/4 of wheat and 1 ounce of gold are equal values or equivalents because they are crystallizations of equal amounts of average labor, or so many days or so many weeks' labor respectively fixed in them. In thus determining the relative values of gold and corn, do we refer in any way whatever to the wages of the agricultural laborer and the miner? Not a bit. We leave it quite indeterminate how their days or weeks' labor was paid, or even whether wage labor was employed at all. If it was, wages may have been very unequal. The laborer whose labor is realized in the quarter of wheat may receive only 2 bushels, and the laborer employed in the mining may receive 1/2 of the ounce of gold. Or, supposing their wages to be equal, they may deviate in all proportions from the values of the commodities produced by them. They may amount to 1/4 or 1/5 or any other proportional part of that 1/4 of corn or the 1 ounce of gold. Their wages can, of course, not exceed nor be more than the values of the commodities they produced. But they can be less in every possible degree. Their wages will be limited by the values of the products, but the values of their products will not be limited by their wages. And above all, the relative values of corn and gold, for example, will have been settled without regard whatever to the value of labor employed. That is to say, to wages. To determine the values of commodities by the relative quantities of labor fixed in them is therefore a thing quite different from the tautological method of determining the values of commodities by the value of labor, or wages. This point, however, will be further elucidated in the progress of our inquiry. In calculating the exchangeable value of a commodity, we must add to the quantity of labor previously worked up in the raw material of the commodity, and the labor bestowed on the implements, tools, machineries, and buildings with which such labor is assisted. For example, the value of a certain amount of cotton yarn is the crystallization of the quantity of labor added to the cotton during the spinning process, the quantity of labor previously realized in the cotton itself, the quantity of labor realized in the coal, oil, and other auxiliary substances used, the quantity of labor fixed in the steam engine, the spindles, the factory building, and so forth. Instruments of production, properly so called, such as tools, machinery, buildings, serve again and again for longer or shorter periods during repeated processes of production. If they were used up at once, like the raw material, their whole value would be at once transferred to the commodities they assist in producing. But as a spindle, for example, is gradually used up, an average calculation is made based upon average time it lasts and its average waste or wear and tear during a certain period, say a day. In this way, we calculate how much of the value of the spindle is transferred to the yarn daily spun, and how much, therefore, the total amount of labor realized in a pound of yarn, for example, is due to the quantity of labor previously realized in the spindle. For our present purpose, it is not necessary to dwell any longer on this point.